Hey ladies, welcome to chapter 7 of The Wounded Heart. This chapter is called ambivalence. So this is the final category of internal damage. We have talked about powerlessness, betrayal, and now we come to ambivalence. This category of internal damage is described as probably the most difficult to put into words. It has the potential to produce more shame and contempt than powerlessness or betrayal, although both of these factors are intertwined with ambivalence. So, the definition of ambivalence is feeling two contradictory emotions at the same time. For example, a woman being very excited and happy for her friend who is getting married, but feeling guilty because at the same time she's also sad and grieving and wishing that she could have a similar experience herself. So, a lot of times we label these emotions that we have. We could say they're weird, they're crazy. These are just inner experiences that reflect a great maturity that is going on within us because we are showing that we are capable of holding two truths at once. Ambivalence revolves around the experience of the relational, sensual, and sexual pleasure that in most cases and to some degree was experienced during the first three stages of sexual abuse. So he starts by saying, I understand people may shudder at the thought of this. It may be embarrassing to hear. It might even feel shameful to hear. But this is something that has been built up in our society as a shameful thing. He gives an example of an abusive father who he worked with, and this father told him that he was of the opinion that little kids like sex. And the father says, I didn't do anything that she did not ask for first. The author, Allender, asked this man, what did the daughter do? What did this little girl do to provoke you fondling her? And the man said, she climbed into my lap and told me to hold her, and so I did. Allender says we have to understand this was wicked and inaccurate thinking on the father's part, because a little girl climbing into your lap for intimacy, child from parent, is completely different of the intimacy partner to partner. So, of course, we do have to discuss the fact that sexual arousal is possible in an unsuspecting victim, because humans have arousal receptors in various locations of their body, and they do respond to touch. But this fact does not justify the sexualization of relationship. So this does not mean that we can argue that a child wants or seeks sexual stimulation unless the child has been raised in a way that they have been repetitively conditioned to associate sexual pleasure with relational intimacy. So if a child has been experiencing sexual advances repeatedly and now in their brain, this is intimacy, this is love, then they do come to expect that kind of intimacy. However, even when this is the case for a child, it still does not make it okay. And that is the exception, not the rule. Just because there are arousal receptors in the body does not in any way mean that arousal equals want or desire, especially when we're speaking of children. So he gives a couple of examples here that might be good for you to go back and read in the book. I won't repeat them here just for time's sake, but he is discussing how victims of sexual abuse who he has worked with explain that they felt ambivalent because in order to survive the situation, eventually their body betrayed them, for lack of better words. And he spoke of one child who, when his body did not respond in the way that his perpetrator and abuser wanted it to respond, he actually was delighted at that because he felt that this was a way of rebelling against the abuse that the perpetrator was trying to do. Allender states that in both cases there was an unacknowledged and undealt with ambivalence that established patterns for these victims in relating to others that went past the abuse and carried over into current relationships. So he says, for this reason, in order for us to understand the patterns in our relationships and heal this, we have to understand the roots of ambivalence. He says that the cause of ambivalence and distorted feelings related to abuse includes factors that involved the past, present, and future. So the past is obvious. There was an experience of relational pleasure, such as being invited to go fishing or being complimented about your attractiveness. And then there could be a past of sensual pleasure, such as being hugged. And there could be a past of sexual pleasure, such as being touched on primary or secondary sexual parts. All of these will arouse deep parts of the soul. Sexual pleasure in particular is both frightening and stimulating to a young child because they're still experiencing a sense of intimacy and relational pleasure because a person is giving them attention. And when this pleasure is connected with the experience that a child goes through of being powerless, betrayed, and used, untold damage occurs. He says that the devastation is just as great when sexual arousal proper has not occurred, but the victim is enjoying other aspects of arousal in the relationship. A young man or woman may experience relational and sensual arousal when an adult is flirting with them. It brings feelings of both enjoyment and shame, which produces the anguish of ambivalence. He says central to understanding ambivalence is the fact that the very thing that was despised also brought some degree of pleasure. The pleasure was, in most cases, the only taste of life available to the famished child. Nevertheless, later, most adults cannot forgive their body or soul for betraying them. He says that the ambivalence about this sense of pleasure relationally helps explain this lingering sense of irrational responsibility for the past abuse. Most victims feel like they were responsible for what occurred, especially if their arousal is viewed as cooperation. It doesn't matter if you tell someone that it wasn't their fault. Of course, you can offer this encouragement, but it's not going to help change what she feels inside because the roots of false responsibility are already patterned in with the soil of contempt. And then there's this unacknowledged or hated ambivalence that they can't quite rid themselves of. He gives a couple more examples here of people who were abused and what that looked like for them and the sense of ambivalence that it caused within them. A sense of confusion, a sense of not understanding why a relationship that had not been stressed was suddenly stressed by this abuse occurring. There are many factors in the present that also create a vortex of self-hatred. So one factor might be when unexpected memories or dreams or fantasies pop up, which is going to be common after you've experienced any kind of abuse, especially sexual abuse. Many abused men and women feel as if a portion of their mind is not under their control. Dream elements return that deposit past horrors before their eyes without rhyme or reason. Pleasant daydreams are suddenly interrupted by the hideous and contorted face of the abuser. A hidden recess of their mind's closet gets dumped into open view at the most unexpected and undesired moment. All of these can contribute to the victim feeling a sense of being out of control, which just leads to the confusion and the anguish that ambivalence causes. What he starts to touch on here is the fact that arousal is mediated by images. So the pictures drawn from our past, arousal or not, any pictures at all, that is what we draw from in order to comprehend our present. We draw on our past experiences. And in order to plan for our future, we look at where we are at in the present and what we have been through in the past. So he says, is it any wonder that many abuse victims use their past victimization as the basis of picturing their current relationships and, in particular, their sexual arousal? This is known as the sexualization of intimate relationships. Intimacy, once fused with abuse, surfaces to some degree or another whenever intimacy is experienced in other relationships. So he says that many abuse victims will misinterpret a longing for intimacy, in general, relational affection, as lustful passion when they begin to care for someone of any gender. So even having experiences of longing to be close to other people can feel dangerous when you've experienced sexual abuse or any form of abuse or betrayal trauma, because it can bring up feelings of powerlessness in the past when you allowed yourself to trust someone and care for them. He goes into how this can affect sexual relationships and the sexual health of victims in the future, such as only being able to orgasm under certain circumstances or carrying yourself as if you are at the same time naive and irresistible. He gives a couple of examples of women who experience sexual abuse not being sure how to carry themselves in future relationships with men, such as a prim and proper woman who is consistently being approached by men, questioning why men find her so appealing, but underneath the surface, it actually causes her to feel arousal because she is being desired and looked at. This is another example of ambivalence playing itself out in someone's life after abuse. He says that all elements of the past, present, and future combine to create a swirling ambivalence that does not find resolution through denial or repeated efforts to control one's thought life. The cost of the convoluted vortex does more damage to the human soul. So essentially, if this is not faced, then it just continues to spiral out of control because a lot of times people cannot make sense of the patterns that they're playing out in future relationships. He says that the internal cost of ambivalence is massive shame and contempt. The topic of sexual abuse is shameful. The sense of being isolated and different from normal, healthy adults is magnified beyond comprehension once the core ambivalence is acknowledged. He speaks of patients who have shown contempt for themselves, such as, "What would my husband do if he found out what happened with my father?" And that now I struggle to separate myself from any man who shows me a sense of kindness. The shame associated with the ambivalence that she's feeling is only intensifying the horror of the past and causing her to not feel connected to her husband in the present. He says shame is compounded by personal confusion. How could I feel arousal and hatred at the same moment? Why do vile images return at the most disconcerting moments? And why do I feel sexually aroused when someone is kind to me? Shame is further complicated when others react to the victim's ambivalence with shock, disgust, or condemnation. He says that there is a false cure for this confusion and rejection, and it's going to be either self-hatred or other-centered contempt. It could propel the person into promiscuous relationships that validate the fears that she held, that the abuse really was her fault all along. It could propel someone into the opposite reaction of being afraid of intimacy at all and never getting close enough to people to begin to feel it. This leads to a consequence of a fear of pleasure, a hatred of longing, greater likelihood of re-victimization, and chronic patterns of compulsiveness. A lot of times, femininity or masculinity is despised or ignored in the victim. Pleasure, any kind of enjoyment, can be suspect and dangerous because if you start to feel it in one area, then the other areas feel threatened and there's the need to pull away. Any kind of physical pleasure, such as just doing well in tennis, could cause someone to be proud of their physical attributes, and this could cause them to shy away from even things that they enjoy because it dances too close to how they felt in the past. He says that intense pleasure in any area of life can provoke too many memories or stir up sorrow, but that's not to suggest that all abuse victims are morose and joyless. A lot of them are actually wonderful storytellers, great fun at parties, and enjoy a great meal and caring friends. For many abuse victims, however, there is a limit, a stiff, angry boundary that will not permit cross traffic. Once the boundary has been reached, the guard goes up, and pleasure must be subdued, not enjoyed. Another consequence of ambivalence is hatred directed toward longing and passion, especially the longing of the soul that arouses the experience of maleness or femaleness. He says that most abuse victims are cynical, suspicious, and terrified of deep-souled passion. The hunger of the human heart for touch, nurture, and intimacy is intertwined with a revulsion for sex, either conscious or submerged, and a hatred of their own arousal. The reaction to the wound is to become immersed in sexual passion, to blunt the original ambivalence, or to remove any sexual passion by deadening the soul and withholding it from the body. So he says that someone could veer in either direction, either promiscuity or the prim and proper woman that he spoke of earlier, and both of these are to protect the self from experiencing what they had to experience before. He says that sexual passion, like any form of pleasure, is intimately connected to the deeper hunger for love and respect. So it's not uncommon for even non-sexual longings to arouse what is felt to be the turmoil of past abuse. For instance, not being able to receive or enjoy a compliment. Even though it feels good to hear it, you can't quite let yourself believe it, and it would have been easier if the person just hadn't said that and hadn't made it awkward. He says this also makes it clear that this person likely cannot enjoy herself as a woman, and kindness is dangerous because it invites her to respond with warmth and joy, and that might be something that she's afraid of giving. Imagine what will happen when someone does manage to arouse the longing in a sexual abuse victim. He says the picture is not always pretty. A lot of times a sexually abused woman will get involved with men who are equally uncomfortable with sexual desire, or sexual athletes who are looking for a next conquest. So we'll often go to someone who does not ask us to be extremely intimate with them, and the relationship might feel empty and meaningless. Or we could seek out someone who has very bold and robust sexual desires, and we find that we are able to just remove ourselves from our bodies in that moment and give them what they want and not have to connect with them deeper on that level. Either way, this is a person who does not require deep-souled involvement. And a lot of times this person, this partner, will be the kind of person who deepens the self and other-centered contempt, which will diminish her struggle with ambivalence. He says that a lot of times the victim will handle the confusion of the soul by drowning his or her wounds in addictive activities. So addictive behavior is the use of any object or repetitive mode of functioning to handle stress, struggle, or sorrow that both impairs personal functioning and relationships and cannot be stopped without extensive outside intervention. He says this might include alcoholism, substance abuse, workaholism, sexaholism, eating disorders, perfectionism, or religious fanaticism. The common element of each is the bondage that is exercised over the individual by the object of obsession and the influence that it has on his or her ability to love others. Personally, I think that this also applies to anything that we can do to distract ourselves from the small present moments in our lives. So even scrolling on a screen, constantly reading books, constantly over-exercising, constantly shopping, things that bring us out of the present moment and help us to not have to face the things that might be troubling us underneath. He talks about core images related to ambivalence, and he says the contemptuous picture of oneself begins with doubts about intelligence and competency, which is the powerlessness, moves to questions about desirability, which is the betrayal, and finally ends with the conclusion that one is dirty, vile, and cheap. So we have thought of ourselves as not smart enough to stop it, not competent enough to stop it, not desirable enough on the inside for someone to want to protect us and prevent that from occurring. And now we could decide that we are just gross and not even worth anyone's time. He says this explains not only why the abuser betrayed the victim in the first place, but it also gives reason for the absence of deep relationship today. So again, this is our way of internalizing it all onto ourselves. And he says that a lot of times we will internalize the picture of being cheap, loose, or more graphically, the image of a whore. He says that this could be shamefully hidden or proudly exhibited. It could be hidden subconsciously and us not even realize it. But it's lived so deeply that one may be surprised by its presence and intensity. The core images that this evokes are contemptuous, and it's an explanation of internal damage, and it gives us a roadmap for living out self-protected patterns of relating to others. He gives examples of a woman who felt like a whore whenever she developed a crush on any unsuspecting male. She shamed herself for even desiring a man in that way. And another woman who was bold, carefree, and wore clothes that were just beyond the border of propriety. It wasn't provocative or seductive, but her mood was loose, free, and sensual. She was very confident and take charge, but she saw herself as a toy or a plaything for fun. And so it showed the internal image of herself as a toy for abuse. He says that in order to understand the images caused by the internal damage of sexual abuse, you need to look at the way the person lives out in his or her interpersonal relationships now. So this concludes the internal map that has been built as a result of the abuse. And then the next section of the book will be an evaluation of the external damage due to abuse. So we'll start with a focus on secondary symptoms most commonly related to abuse and the typical styles of relating that are associated with these core images of the internal damage that we've been discussing here. As always, if anything comes up for you that is difficult or you would like help or support with or just want to chat about it, I'm here. You can email me at ashana@yournorthstarrising.com. You can also reach out in the book club chat if that feels comfortable for you. And again, if at any moment this feels like too much, please be sure to stop, give yourself rest or breaks if needed, and take it easy on yourself. We'll chat more next week.